Welcome to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Markle. I'm a curriculum development specialist here at NCBRT, and I work in collaboration with subject matter experts to create valuable and timely training for the responder community. The National Center for Biomedical Research and Training provides mobile training to both the national and international emergency response community. Welcome back to the podcast. Last time we talked to Mark DuPont and Eric Vandenberg about what bias is and why it's so important to talk about within the public safety space. Today, we're continuing our conversation about what to do when we recognize bias in ourselves and also in others. So to start us off, we touched on this a bit in part one, but how do we recognize bias in ourselves from a practical standpoint?
Well, I think that we have to accept that there are things like conscious biases and there are unconscious biases. And I think the unconscious ones are the ones that are probably the most dangerous in that we're not aware of them, they're hidden in there, and we got to be aware that they might rear their ugly head in our work as public safety professionals. You know, the conscious bias is just that. It's something that we know it's happening consciously. Again, I go back to what we joked about in the last podcast about, you know, the Red Sox are the greatest franchise ever, and obviously that's a conscious bias. I know that I have that, and I'm
incorrect.
But the serious part about that is a conscious bias is usually where we exhibit that negative behavior, whether it be a racial prejudice, whether it be a religious prejudice, whether it be a political feeling, and what can come of that is things like physical or verbal harassment. So that conscious biases are bad things, and unfortunately people don't recognize them as a bias. They just think that that is right and everything else is wrong. So this is where you get discrimination. This is where you get discrimination against a race of people, a group of people. This is where also malicious intent can bleed off of that. So that's obvious and evident all around us. The unconscious is a little bit different in that they operate outside of our awareness, hence the reason the word unconscious. And they can be in direct conflict or contrast to beliefs and values that I think I hold. Meaning, I may say that I'm not prejudiced to anybody that's a New York Yankees fan, but how I act towards them, things that I may do by separating them out from conversations or work that I'm doing or whatever, now actually starts bleeding over into actions that I'm taking. So I may not be aware of them, or I may think that it's not affecting my attitude, it's not affecting my behavior, it's not affecting my decision. But because they're unconscious, they might be a little bit difficult to identify. So we then have to be thinking about that if we're going to agree that we're going to change that and not let an unconscious or even a conscious bias affect how we're doing our jobs, then the first thing we have to be is humble. Eric said it in the last podcast, you know, about our egos, right? We got to put the ego at the door, and we got to recognize that a bias could affect the outcome of what I'm about to do. And I don't want that to happen as a professional, as a law enforcement professional, as a member of a behavioral threat assessment management team, whatever. Heck, as a father, as a parent, as a husband, I don't want those things to influence what I do and have a bad outcome, have a bad effect. So first and foremost on my list is you just got to put your ego at the door, and you have to be humble and recognize that if you have one, you could negatively affect the outcome of what you're trying to do. So open your mind to the fact that if you have it, be aware of it.
And humility doesn't come easy to everybody.
Correct. Correct. Especially in our world of work.
I think one important thing, in training and recognizing bias is framing it as a skill and a strength. Being, understanding that we all have biases, some more, some less, but the ability to recognize it is a real strength to have, just in general.
That's a really good point. I like how you worded that. Considering it a strength.
It can be challenging.
Yeah. And, to reinforce what you just said, Ashley, on another conversation I just had as recently as last Friday, when you look at mental health in the law enforcement public safety profession, there's a stigma associated with that, especially if someone wants to get help because of their mental health concerns or needs. And my point at that time was we should treat mental health the same way we treat physical health. We encourage our officers to go to a gym and work out. Some agencies give them time while they're on the clock to go do that. There's no stigma to that. The same should be held true to mental health, and to forward that to this conversation, recognizing that, hey, if I can be aware of my potential biases or those of others I'm working with, that's a superpower, that's a strength. And so to do that, I need to walk in to my work with the openness to question my opinion. In other words, hey, I think this is what's happening. Now, wait a minute. What am I basing that on? Where's the facts that I'm getting at? This is a conversation that I can have in my head, or I can have it with the group. Hey, I think this. Now let's see if there are facts that support that, or is it just a bias that I might be exhibiting here? So if I have a thing that I'm pointing to that's influencing my decision, why? Why does that particular background experience influence that, and is it potentially influencing it in a wrong way? Could be in a good way. It could be an experience that no one else has, that I can safely conclude, having gone through it, that if we allow this person to continue on this pathway, this is where it might end up. So it could be a positive thing, but humbleness, ability to question your opinions. Those are two things that pop out at the top of my list.
You have to think about everything that influences you as a person, because that's going to factor into your biases.
Right.
As far as family, friends, relationships, finance, politics, that's all going to shape your opinions.
Thing I think is really interesting to talk about and think about is, law enforcement is many times more likely to experience traumatic events compared to the general public. And, all of our past experiences affect our future decisions.
Correct.
And, if we have a very real experience that was, very stressful or traumatic, and then we are faced with a different a future situation, we're superimposing our traumatic experience onto this current one and maybe not making as good of a decision based on the bias that very big event in our lives had on our brains.
Right. And where that translates. So Ashley, let's extend that. So it's not only that traumatic event that happened. But in the course of my job as a police officer, I've done X amount of investigations. I've had X amount of interactions with people. And sometimes we let the normalcy ladder or normalcy level adjust to that experience. And so then we think that every person, the vast majority of these interactions are going to go like this. And we walk into the next one with that package of reference points, and we assume that that normalcy level is way up here, where in this particular instance, no, wait a minute, based on that person's background, based on that person's events in their lives, the triggers, the stressors, the things that are happening in their life, they're not you, Eric. They're not you, Joey. They're not you, Susie. Their view of what's happening is this, and we have to adjust to that and walk in their shoes, if you will, to understand how they're perceiving this. So we can get very, the expression is calloused or jaded. We build up this callous about how we think every one of these things is going to go. And then back to what we talked about in the previous podcast, that could be affirmation bias, meaning, or confirmation bias or availability bias. It can trick over in any one of those things where we're just pointing back to what that experience is that we have, and we're applying it to this, thinking it's the exact same thing. So being aware of it, I think, is so important. And to Eric's point, let that ego stay at the door here for a minute, which requires me to be motivated to look inwardly. And that's a really important aspect. Let me say it again. I have to be motivated to turn the camera around and look at myself. And sometimes that's not easy, and we don't want to. But let's go back to all these factors that we were talking about. Am I fatigued? Am I in a bad mood today because I had a fight with my wife last night that's spilling over into today? Or I'm having issues with my parents and taking care of them, which actually is going on in my life right now. Are those things influencing how I'm thinking? Is my thinking so caught up in those factors that I'm not seeing what's right in front of me, the forest through the trees things? And so I need to be willing to accept that I can't be exactly the same every day. I can give 100% of what I have today. I always use that expression. We are, as human beings, we can't give 100% of every single solitary day. We're human. Things just, there's an ebb and flow in our life. You could be like Eric that has a bad cold today. He's not going to be his full 100% Eric, but he is giving us 100% of what he has today. And we have to recognize that. So is what is happening in my life influencing, is it evoking, conflict in others because I'm fatigued or irritated or having a bad day? Is it increasing tension amongst the team? Is it impacting my professional development? So the point is, I have to stay motivated to be able to look at myself and recognize the benefit of that. And to your point earlier, Ashley, which I love, I have to look at it as a strength, that I'm willing to turn that camera around and look at myself and make sure that I'm not doing it. What I talk about when we're teaching this class is I always ask, if we've come to a conclusion as a team about whether or not we think this person is on the pathway to violence, I always build in that I'm going to ask, okay, is there anywhere in here, now that we've made that comment, that decision, where I've exhibited a bias that may have clouded this, or anyone else? I'll start with myself. Is there anything that I did that might be letting that bias seep through? And has anyone else allowed a bias to cloud their vision? So it's kind of a self-check.
I think going back to what you said, Ashley, being law enforcement, a lot of times you get to see the not so nice part of humanity and the way people act, and that can cloud your opinions. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to accept, to be able to deal with that, and you can't let it have an overwhelming effect on you.
Thing that I just keep thinking about is, in my life, when I'm experiencing a bias or I'm letting, a bad day affect, how I talk to my husband or something like that, I can take a step back usually and just be like, okay, let me remove myself from this and let me, understand why I'm acting this way or whatever. But in law enforcement, you don't always have the ability to take a step back and assess, your biases in like a deep way. Sometimes you have to make a split decision in an emergency or in a very emotionally tense situation. So how do you grapple with that? If that's even a question you can answer fully.
I think that there's a part when you just talked about your life, and earlier I've talked about my life. You have to learn your history. And what I mean by that is, well, Mark, of course I know my history. No, hang on. You really got to learn how it could possibly impact how you react to certain things, how you make decisions. Just understand that part of it, the science part of it, if you will. So your history, your experience, to Eric's point about where we become jaded because of the interactions that we typically make and what type of people that we're interacting with, recognize that may have an impact. Now, by the way, it might be a good impact. I'm not saying every time it's a bad impact. That, as I said earlier, that history has some value. I might have a experience that's relative to this particular case that we're investigating that is of value to the team. So, and that goes back to an earlier comment in the previous podcast that Eric made about the diversity of a behavioral threat assessment team, having people who are mental health workers, social workers, school administrators, lawyers. All those things help give just a different perspective on our views as we're talking about it as a team. But there's another part that comes out of that. And if I understand my history, I understand how those things may affect me, I need to work personally on reducing my stressors. I need to, in my story, I was saying, did I have a fight with my wife last night? Am I dealing with issues of taking care of elderly parents? What helps reduce my stress on those things so that I don't carry that into work? I don't carry that into a behavioral threat assessment that I'm doing with my team. And last point I'll make, it goes back to another thing we talked about in the last podcast about understanding someone's story. I have to increase my sense of other people and humanity and understand that, yeah, all this baggage I'm carrying, well, what's the baggage that Ashley's carrying or Eric's carrying, or again, Joey or Susie or whoever else is on my team, or the person that we're interacting with? What's the story? And what impact might that have on the decisions that they're making as it relates to behavioral threat assessments? If you think about how this plays out, if I look at that whole story and understand the whole story, now our job actually becomes easier, because if I can eliminate those stressors, if I can reduce those triggers, guess what? We're not arresting Johnny because of what he is thinking about doing. We're putting him on the pathway to success. We're taking him off the pathway to violence and we're putting him on a pathway to success. So rather than just making snap decisions based on what I'm seeing and letting those biases impact my viewpoint, let's understand a little bit more about who this person is and where they're coming from before we make the decisions that we're making, which forces me to be, again, turn that camera around a little bit. And is there anything that I'm doing that might be impacting this?
I think it's important when you talk about factual evidence and being able to educate yourself.
Yeah, good point. So I may not know anything about why Yankees fans like the Yankees. I may not know anything about that, but if I really truly want to understand it, let me investigate a little further. Let me read about or talk to people and understand all those things that make them so popular in this particular segment of the population. So by learning that, doesn't mean I have to agree with it. I just understand it a little bit better so that when I have conversations, I can be more factual in my conversation, be more open to discussion as opposed to, no, you're wrong, which is pretty much what I say to Eric all the time.
He does. I mean, for me, it came back to when I was growing up as a kid, my dad was a diehard Mickey Mantle fan. So we couldn't root for anybody else in the house. If you'd be ostracized and thrown out of the family if you rooted for anybody else.
And even that, let's go a little further with that, Eric. When you read about Mickey Mantle, when you read, on the Red Sox, when you read about these stories, when you read about Babe Ruth or Carl Yastrzemski, which was my favorite player, you read about who they are. Man, it's fascinating to understand why they did what they did, what their background was, how they got to where they got to, which creates more admiration for that individual when you understand what they had to do to get to where they are, or Ted Williams, and so it just fuels the passion, if you will, for that particular person, that particular organization. Well, the same holds true in what we're talking about. Why does Ashley think this way? What's Ashley's whole story? What's her background? What is she passionate about? Why does she connect to this particular thing? And I'm sorry I keep beating this drum, but if you go to behavioral threat assessment and we do all that for the individual we're looking at who might be on the pathway to violence, by doing that, we've outlined what we need to do in order to get them off of that pathway and towards the pathway to success and prevent that person from going and doing what they're thinking about doing. Man, there's nothing more powerful to me than that. Now imagine if we apply it in how we interact with everybody. I know you can't do it for everybody. I know when you go to the grocery store and bang into someone's cart, you don't have a chance to understand the whole story and what they're going through. But it just gives us cause, rather than get emotional about what that reaction may be. Hey, that person might be having a bad day. Maybe not. Maybe they're just a jerk. Which happens. But it just, I don't know, it just makes a difference in how you go through your life day to day.
So shifting gears a little bit, we've talked a lot about recognizing bias in ourselves. How do teams play into this? What should a team member do if they recognize bias in another person?
I'll be blunt. Call it out.
Yeah.
I think that, confront it. I think that, so let's back up a little bit. Before we see that bias reveal itself in a team, we should start, I would hope that the team and someone who's taking the leadership position just says, let's go into this, let's put our egos at the door, our biases at the door, and let's make sure that at the end we're checking ourselves and making sure that we're not using any biases to make our decision. So I set the stage, which allows for that confrontation, if you will. That sounds too strong a word, but at least you're calling out, hey, Ashley, I hear what you said, but is that possibly a affirmation bias or a confirmation bias or a foresight bias? Is that potentially a bias? And hopefully as a team, if you said it to me, Mark, I think this might be it. It just causes me to sit back for a moment and think about why I'm saying what I'm saying. Is there a bias that's clouding my vision? And if I can look at it and say, no, I'm basing this on this fact, to Eric's point, I'm making it fact-based, and that's very, very important when we're operating as a team. Johnny did this, this, and this, which is telling me that Johnny is on the pathway to violence, and therefore I think we have to take this action. Well, the whole group hears that and goes, okay, yep, check, all right, that wasn't a bias. And me personally, I want to thank Eric or Ashley or whoever called me out on it, say thank you for looking at it that way and keep doing that. Don't ever be afraid to call me out if you think I've got a bias. And the more we work that way, the more we are open to that, we don't get defensive about it.
Yeah, and
because
you have to consider. I'm sorry.
No, I think the first time, if we're working together and the first time you say that, my natural tendency is to get defensive about it, right? No, well, wait a minute, hang on. And this is literally how my brain works. I'll get defensive about it, and then I'll say out loud, I'll say, all right, wait a minute, hang on. Let me step back. Let me look at this. Let me articulate why I said what I said or I'm recommending what I do. By using those words out loud, I'm forcing myself to go back. And guess what? If I go back and can't find the facts to support, I'm going to say, you know what? Thanks for calling me out, Ashley, because, there really isn't facts that support this. This is just an opinion that I have. Go ahead, Eric.
But I was going to say, consider that the structure of your team, because it shouldn't be all put on one person to make decisions.
Good point.
And you need to be receptive and open to criticism.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way that you can challenge it. You got to challenge your own thoughts and realize that, okay, maybe I can look at this a different way. Maybe educating myself and getting to know a little bit more, and then looking at the other people in your team as far as their backgrounds are concerned, and try to think of it from all different perspectives.
Good point. Good point. I mean, if we consciously go at that, trying to look at it from all perspectives, if you're the mental health professional and Eric is the school administrator, and Ashley says, I think Johnny is on the pathway to violence and we should do this. As a team member, I'm going to say, tell me why you think that, Ashley. Based on your experience, why do you think that? Now, I'll be listening to that. And if you say, well, it's just how I feel. I've been in school administration or mental health for 30 years, and this is my experience. Okay, red flag going up. I hear you. I value your experience. But as a team, we've got to point to the facts. Are there facts there that support this? And just by talking like that, everybody kind of gets in the habit of working together and recognizing that. I mean, doing this training, we've done a whole bunch of these courses now, Eric, and I'm pretty sure Eric will validate what I'm about to say. The most enjoyable part is watching them work as a team. So you got a bunch of people that come together. They've never met each other. They're from different disciplines, and we purposely mix them up and make sure that they're not all from the same agency if we can.
In some cases, they're even from different parts of the country.
Right. And you throw them in a room together and you say, okay, here's the facts of the case. Tell us what you would do with this. Tell us what the next step would be. And you hear that type of conversation. And what's real interesting is you'll see some dynamics where you might have someone that maybe isn't as bold, new team. They don't know these people. Should I really step out and say what I think is happening? And of course, you'll have others that are no problem. They're bold and A-type personalities, and they'll shut it out. And you watch and see if that gets balanced. Sometimes it doesn't. We've witnessed some circumstances where people have dominated the discussion as a team, and we've had to kind of step in and say, wait a minute, time out here. Are we going down a pathway just that's based on your experience? And we're not allowing the school administrator, the mental health professional, the pastor, the religious leader, whatever, to contribute to this. And, you'll see some defensiveness sometimes, but usually we can expose that there might be some biases controlling where that team is going. And hopefully they see it, they catch it, and the lesson they learn is when they go back to their jurisdictions, they don't allow the same thing to happen.
That's about all I have. Was there anything that you feel like you wanted to end our conversation with?
Well, I'll make my comment and then Eric can make his, but I think the most important thing, hopefully, that we've explained is that be aware that you and others on your team have biases, that it's not like they might have. Everybody has them, so they're normal. Be aware of them. But most importantly, recognize if they're influencing some of the decisions that you're making or influencing your behavior. And then if you do recognize that, then counter that. And one of the ways you counter it, as Eric pointed out, just educate yourself about what that particular viewpoint may be or where those facts may be coming from, and just be able to contribute to the conversation with that understanding. Eric,
be open to criticism and accept it.
As he puts on his New York Yankees hat. Okay, yeah.
Man, y'all just brought this theme around.
Yeah, exactly. Well, everybody's listening is going to have their own opinion, and I'm sure they're going to send you text messages, Eric, that say,
"Oh, it's like LSU, Alabama."
Yeah, exactly. It's all going to be good.
Well, a big thank you to Mark and Eric for joining us for this series. It was great to have this conversation with y'all. I could have had a conversation about this all day. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Mark.
If you have any questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at podcast@ncbrt.lsu.edu. Make sure you subscribe to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and we'll see you again next time.